What's up, how you doing? I am David Long. For those of you who don't know me, I'm an integral philosopher and a critic of both Ken Wilber and of Jordan Peterson. What you're about to see is a clip from a video I made where Ken Wilber on Rebel Wisdom talks about Jordan Peterson and says that he's integral. I am here today to explain to you why he's not integral. If you enjoy this clip, consider watching the full-length version. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoy. If you do, please like and subscribe and check out more videos.
What do these two hugely influential thinkers have in common? Where do they disagree? And what can they learn from each other?
A lot of times when it comes to Jordan Peterson, it's not that I'll disagree with much of what he says. I agree with much of what he says. It's some of the things that he leaves out.
I actually agree with a lot of what both of these guys say. I'm critical of both of them, but the reason I'm so critical of both of them is because I agree with so much of what they say. And I think the more agreement you have with a person, the more important those areas of disagreement seem. When you have so many core agreements with a person, so many things where it seems like we should just agree because we have the same methodology, we have the same standards. It's like in science. If you perform the same tests in the same kinds of ways and you come up with different conclusions with the same standards, you start to be like, okay, what's going on here? So the more agreement you have, the more the disagreements stand out, the more important they become. And figuring out who gets it right and why is important because it allows us to understand how to get it right and how to get it wrong. Then we can start to add that to our epistemic filter and make better and better discriminations and thus have better and better actions in the world. Let's continue.
Jordan Peterson has become a global celebrity by weaving together mythology, science, philosophy, and religion into a compelling theory of everything.
All right, hold on. Here we are, 16 seconds in. Jordan Peterson has a compelling theory of everything. In this video, we're going to be talking about how Ken Wilber, Sam Harris, and Jordan Peterson rise up to or fail to live up to integral standards. What does that mean? Integral is about integrating diversity with discernment, and that discernment part is key. The core lenses of an integral perspective are summarized in AQAL, or all quadrants, all levels, but it equally connotes all lines, all states, and all types. All quadrants, all levels, all lines, all states, and all types. So during the course of this video, we're going to be looking at how each one of these people relates to quadrants. Do they include all the quadrants? To lines. Do they have a healthy relationship with lines? Do they include lines? To stages. Do they include the stages? And of course, we're going to be paying attention to the positive and negative ideas associated with or correlated with different stages of development. And to states, or waking up, as well as growing up. We don't really get into types too much in this video. Suffice to say, everyone mentioned in this video accepts types, and that's probably why we're not talking about it. For example, in this video, it said that Jordan Peterson is a lower left quadrant reductionist, and it's implied that Ken Wilber gives too much emphasis to the upper left quadrant. It's also implied that Sam Harris only includes the exterior quadrants and ignores the interior quadrants. The idea is that we want to include all of these things and not reduce it to just the parts that we know about or like. So when I talk later about making the right distinctions, these are the kind of distinctions I'm going to be looking for or listening for. Just because you integrate in different ideas from different perspectives, from mythology, from science, from religion, from philosophy, doesn't mean you have a clear, concise, well-articulated, or well-understood worldview. Integrating in a bunch of different perspectives is what starts to happen at green or postmodern stages. This is why they accept and love everyone. But at integral stages, we integrate diversity with discernment. And Jordan Peterson's discernment is not really consistent. He can use a Jungian approach to archetypes and mythology a lot of the time, but then other times his discernment isn't so good, where he can't answer a simple question about whether Jesus, a literal historical person, was resurrected from the dead or not, or whether that's a metaphor.
Do you believe that Jesus rose again from the dead? Literally.
I cannot answer that question. And the reason is because, okay, let me think about it for a minute, see if I can come up with a reasonable answer to that. Well, the first answer would be, it depends on what you mean by Jesus.
A historical human being that existed, literally came back to life after death.
I would say that at the moment I'm agnostic about that issue.
That's very
I
interesting.
can't explain why. When I get to the New Testament in my biblical lectures, I'll spend like 6 hours trying to explain what I think about that. But one of the things I have come to learn over the last 15 years in particular is that the world is a very, very strange place. It's far stranger than we think.
Well, someone once asked you whether you thought Jesus was literally resurrected, and you said it would take me 40 hours to answer that question.
I said it would take me 40 hours to answer the question. I didn't say that he was.
How's this for an answer? Almost certainly not. What's wrong with that answer?
Well, in the case of Christ, let's assume he was a historical figure. Is his resurrection real? Did his body resurrect? I don't know. I don't know what happens to a person if they bring themselves completely into alignment. I've had intimations of what that might mean. We don't understand how the world could be mastered if it was mastered completely. We don't know how an individual might be able to manage that. We don't know what transformations that might make possible.
You'll notice when Peterson tells us the meaning of Genesis, he doesn't agree with the literal meaning.
It depends.
What I want to do is make an empirical case for the biblical stories and leave the metaphysical case hanging.
Peterson cannot consistently make transrational distinctions. He says he's agnostic about a lot of this stuff because things are weirder than we can know. He appeals to mystery. So again, he's not making these distinctions in a clear way. He still thinks that there's some magic stuff. He's not making these distinctions clearly. Wilber's giving him more credit than he's actually due. He also claimed that shamanic people all over the world intuited DNA because there are intertwined snakes shown in art.
I really do believe this, although it's very complicated to explain why. I really believe that's a representation of DNA. And that representation, that entwined double helix, that is everywhere.
Instead of just realizing that these people have probably seen snakes mating.
Okay, here we go. Snake sex. They twisting like Chubby Checker. They twisting the night away. Do anybody sell snake pornos? This is amazing, cuz. Look at this. This is beautiful. It's like synchronized swimming. The snake sex is fun to watch. I could have 2 snakes that could do this and put them in a cage and just watch them do this all day.
So he's not real good with the integration of myth.
He won't himself profess belief in any of what those stages actually say.
I really do believe this, although it's very complicated to explain why. I really believe that's a representation of DNA.
Definitely there's tons of philosophy that he's not really doing well, like he's conflating the good and the true. So that's not off to a great start. His integration of science isn't great because he's not really skillfully integrating truth.
It sounds like what you're saying is that truth is as much about action as it is about some sort of material, measurable, objective reality.
No, I'm saying it's more about action.
More about
Oh, yes. The fundamentals of truth are those that guide action. And then the objective science is nested inside that. It has to be. Right. There's no way around that. There's only one way you can define truth in relationship to finite beings. It's true enough. True enough for what? True enough so that you survive and reproduce. That's it. You don't get to go any farther. What's more true than that? Sorry, can't ask that question. That's it. You've hit the limit. Ebola is not that contagious, and so that's kind of annoying if you're trying to kill people, whereas smallpox is really contagious. So if you could get the two together and then develop an aerosol spray, you could kill a lot of people. It isn't obvious to me that that's an invalid scientific pursuit. But I do think that it's an invalid ethical pursuit, and so that seems to me to indicate that the ethical pursuit supersedes the scientific pursuit with regards to truth claim. The fundamentals of truth are those that guide action, and then the objective science is nested inside that. The ethical pursuit supersedes the scientific pursuit with regards to truth claim.
It doesn't supersede with respect to the truth claim, it supersedes with respect to considerations of behavior and policy.
He's doing this type of lower left quadrant absolutism to the point of absurdity. Peterson is also making a truth claim about truth claims. So he's using the same notion of truth as accuracy, while also trying to say that truth only means goodness. So Sam points this out to him at a couple points, that he's conflating these different ideas and that becomes incredibly problematic. He is making truth claims, and it is either true or not, in an absolute sense.
There are facts of the matter, whether or not anyone understands them. And some of these facts have nothing to do with the survival of the species. One wonders whether this claim applies to itself. Is this claim about truth only true if it helps us survive? And what if it doesn't? Does it then bite its own tail and just disappear? Do you see the problem there? You clearly have to have a conception of facts and truth that is possible to know, that exceeds what anyone currently knows and exceeds any concern about whether it is useful or compatible with your own survival even to know these truths. Now, the claim about whether or not she's cheating on you is an intelligible claim. That's a claim that has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not you wind up killing yourself based on your reaction to this unhappy truth. If you then wound up killing yourself, we could say at the end of the day, well, it would be better if he hadn't known that. It would certainly be better if she hadn't done that. It would have been better if he had married a different woman.
It might be better if he would have paid attention to his damn marriage and to attribute the and to attribute such a way that
Jordan, you have to grant one thing here. There's one piece that doesn't get moved here. You cannot move the piece that because you killed yourself, it's not true that she was having an affair. That move is not open to you, and yet you're acting like it is.
What I found really fascinating about Jordan Peterson, watching especially the Maps of Meaning series, is that he is also attempting a real integral theory of everything. This reminded me very much of your project. How do you feel that his thought maps onto yours, and what are the core differences?
The point about Jordan Peterson is that he has an enormous amount of respect for objective science.
Come on. He does not have an enormous amount of respect for objective science. He conflates the good and the true. If you've listened to his podcasts with Sam Harris about truth, it's like forehead-slappingly painful. Even most of his fans were like, are you freaking kidding me? He is a lower left quadrant reductionist. He does not respect science. Like, now, people are going to be like, what do you mean? He quotes science here, or he quotes science there. Dude, postmodernists will cherry pick science. Even traditional people will appeal to science if they think it agrees with them. They tend to ignore science in the way that it disagrees with them.
Okay, well, then I would say that I don't think that facts are necessarily true. So I don't think that scientific facts, even if they're correct from within the domain that they were generated, I don't think that that necessarily makes them true.
He has an enormous amount of respect for objective science.
Just think about that question where he can't answer whether Jesus rose again from the dead. He just says, oh, things are weirder than we think, appealing to mystery. I don't know, I'm agnostic about it. That Sam Harris talk on truth is just painful. Anybody who thinks that Jordan Peterson appreciates objective truth, just go listen to that. And that should stop that from happening. And his integration of religion isn't great because he favors Christianity over all other traditions.
Again, this has been focused through the lens of your attachment to Christianity, largely, but Hinduism is a completely different set of stories. Many of them have the opposite valence from any Christian story you would tell. Good and evil do not have the same meaning in the East. Evil is just ignorance on some level.
You haven't met any real evil people if you believe that.
Well, okay, so then all the Hindus and Buddhists are wrong about this. That's a possible claim. I'm just saying that there's over 1 billion people who have a religious system of stories from which they derive all kinds of meaning, to which they're mightily attached, where we could play the same game of archetypal interpretation and valuing, and yet the cash value with respect to good and evil is irreconcilable with what you get from Christianity. Look, presumably, Hinduism is also useful as a set of heuristics for Hindus. If Hinduism and Christianity are irreconcilable, then there must be a deeper level of reality that explains why they both work, that can't be reducible to Christianity being true or Hinduism being true.
So this is not a skillful integral perspective that we're talking about. He doesn't even have a transpersonal view. This is why he gets confused about whether Jesus was literally resurrected from the dead or not, is because he still kind of thinks that the story of Jesus is about a historical person and he's not really taking it metaphorically. We've seen him make a distinction between Jesus and the Christ, but I haven't heard him invite you to be the Christ or say that I myself am a manifestation of the Christ. Like, he doesn't own that God in first person. He doesn't have that kind of transpersonal view.
Peterson is perfectly aware of waking up. He's absolutely aware of it. But he doesn't really talk about that. So he talks about more the growing up components and how that happened.
Totally agree. He doesn't talk about the waking up stuff. He talks about growing up. He talks about ego development. He's all vertical, no horizontal, and only vertical up to a certain point. He basically wants people to develop their ego up to like rational and traditional and stop there. When it comes to having a transpersonal perspective, his advice to people is go clean your room, get your stuff together, develop a healthy ego, which are more the values at Orange, the achiever self, reinforced by this traditional idea. His rule 6 is, until you've put your house in perfect order, don't criticize the world. This is an adaptation of the idea of take the plank out of your own eye before you worry about the speck in your brother's. So these are traditional and modern conventional ideas. These are not transpersonal, existentially aware, ego construct aware perspectives on religion and the self. And Peterson has no clear articulated book about a theory of everything. He talks about being clear in your speech as another one of his rules, Rule 10. But when it comes to words, Jordan Peterson has been compared to Deepak Chopra in terms of the weaselly way he changes definitions or over-convolutes ideas.
I'm convinced that he's one of the most overrated public intellectuals of our time, and that this is especially the case when it comes to his views on religion. In fact, I will go so far as to say that Jordan Peterson is the Deepak Chopra of Christianity. Peterson is no doubt a very smart, knowledgeable and insightful person, but when it comes to religion, he's no better than any other apologist. He manipulates language, misrepresents philosophy and science, and is fallacious in his reasoning.
That's part of Jordan Peterson's shtick, to kind of leave things undefined or muddy the waters or get bogged down in the semantics of the meanings of words in order to kind of do a bit of a sleight of hand thing and make you think that the stuff that he's saying is deeper or more profound than it actually is.
Slavery is condoned in the Bible, in both Testaments, and in the Quran. There's no getting away from that. Now, you can say, well, it's not the central thrust of any of these books, but if you go to the books and try to figure out what the creator of the universe wants with respect to the owning and needless immiseration of other people, he expects you to keep slaves, and he's told you how to do it. The problem was they were actually on the losing side of a theological argument, and it would be much better, I think you would agree, if one of the 10 commandments had been, don't keep slaves. There's certainly one we could swap out for that one.
Would you agree that there are things written into these religious texts that are unambiguously unacceptable viewed through a modern lens, and not because the texts are so complicated that we have misunderstood something, but there are things that are just written in there that we now understand to be wrong?
You have to read the beginning as if it's also influenced by the end, which is what, by the way, and in case you think that I'm weaseling around here, and I'm not, is that that's exactly what you do every time you read any story, any work of fiction. Like if you're a screenwriter, for example, there's an old dictum that if there's a rifle lying on a table in the first scene, that it better be used by the end of the second scene, or it shouldn't have been there at all. So there's this coherence.
I'm looking for the rifle in your answer to this question, though.
Yeah,
I want it to be used. Jesus never envisioned a world without slavery, and he admonished slaves to serve their masters well and to serve their Christian masters especially well.
The English Protestants wouldn't have agreed with that because, like I said, they were at the forefront of the fight against slavery.
Okay,
so
but
I think there
they
was
were
a
clearly
range
influenced by something outside the text. And this is, again, you're making this harder than it is, and my concern is why. Right?
Well, I don't think I am, Sam, because I think that the fundamental message in the New Testament, for example, is that...
So Jews are in possession of a book that has some diabolical passages that would be better left out.
Again, how is this not weaseling? Why doesn't Jordan simply say, yes, the verses that command us to keep slaves and execute homosexuals, apostates, and blasphemers are unacceptable?
If I got his back to the wall, Deepak could honestly say, listen, I've never said anything about crystals, right? I'm not selling crystals. I've never said they work. But it's the way in which he's failing to make the clear differentiation. If you're in a parish of one, but not in the parish that has anything in common with the Bible thumpers in my country who think that Jesus is very likely coming back in their lifetime because he never died, and he's going to judge the living and the dead, and there will be a resurrection, hellfire, and all the rest. If that's not the game you're playing at all, own it.
Like half the time when Harris is asking him this stuff, Peterson is trying to find a way that what Sam Harris said wasn't true. Sam Harris is like, well, you can't really pray and make things come true. And then Peterson finds an extreme version of how that could be possible. And it's like, sure, that kind of works, and you're sort of making the distinction, but why don't you just start from Sam Harris's side and then move outward?
I say, I don't believe in ghosts, and you say, no, you do believe in ghosts. Ghosts are your relationship to the unseen. That's a ghost. So you have a new definition of ghost that you're putting in the place provided, which I have to say, well, of course I have a relationship to the unseen, so yeah, I guess I do believe in ghosts. You know, you win that argument. But that simply isn't what most people mean by a ghost.
Be like, look, Sam, I totally agree with you that there's no literal God, that praying is just talking to yourself, that it's not literally true and it doesn't actually work in the kind of way that a lot of people think that it does. Of course, that's childish and ridiculous. But there's this metaphorical way in which God does care if you masturbate. All these kinds of examples where it's just like Peterson ends up taking the other extreme just to be like, well, so what if God does care care about masturbating? Or what if God does answer prayer? So instead of doing the integral thing and starting from the inside, agreeing with the person and helping them to expand their perspective further, he just takes the oppositional position in kind of a snarky sort of a way, like, well, see, Sam, you don't really know what you're talking about. Like, it's just unskillful and not really pointed. Even if he's kind of right, he's not really skillfully and consistently making those distinctions, especially for people who do disagree with him, and it does still end up feeling really weaselly. Like, you're still just justifying the thing instead of being willing to admit that it's not really literally true. And I mean, even Sam Harris and this other guy bring to him this distinction, like, can we make the distinction between literal truth and metaphorical truth? And Peterson's not even happy to like jump on this distinction and be like, yes, that's what I'm talking about. Peterson's not really doing a good job when it comes to this distinction. Again, not as good of a job as a lot of people are wanting to give him credit for. It's like they're not really looking at everything that he's saying. They're just seeing that he's kind of doing it a lot of the time, but not really seeing the big picture of all of what he's saying and all of what he's trying to do, and how he doesn't consistently integrate in mythology or consistently deal with religion with fair overarching standards. Anyways, I digress. The point being, integrating in a bunch of different ideas does not make you integral. It's the way that we integrate, our epistemology, our method of integration, the distinctions that we make, our epistemology as a filter for ideas. It's those distinctions that make a person integral. I do have a video about integral epistemology, or what we call integral methodological pluralism, which is about including all the different methods, but including them in context in a way that takes into account the different strengths and weaknesses of each different approach to truth. And as you will clearly hear if you listen to his talks with Sam Harris, Peterson does not have the best relationship with the truth, definitely not an integral perspective on truth. Let's continue.
Theory is the idea that cultures and societies go through specific levels of development in the same way as individuals do, becoming more sophisticated as they develop or grow up. It's an idea that's common to developmental theorists, including Peterson's favourite, Jean Piaget.
You move from one knowledge structure to the next one, which includes the previous one and is better. And it's better because it covers more territory. That's how you know it's better. It does the same thing the old tool does, plus some additional things. So it's a definition of better.
So here it's saying, hey, look, Jordan Peterson's talking about hierarchy, and spiral dynamics is talking about hierarchy. Integral? No. We know Peterson understands the concept of hierarchy, but it seems like his understanding of hierarchy more has to do with development of particular lines. You can get good at different competencies.
But then there are growth hierarchies.
Are those the same thing as what Peterson would describe as hierarchies of competence?
Close to it.
But I'm not sure if he actually sees stages of development like integralists do, because I don't think that he would say that postmodernists are at a higher stage than modernists and traditionalists. And he clearly doesn't see that there are higher stages still.
If you look at all of the sort of dozen or so multiple intelligences, and again, if you don't like that concept, I know Peterson doesn't like that.
That's true. Peterson does reduce all lines to cognitive development. He says there are not multiple intelligence, that everything reduces back to cognitive. And so talk about a reductionist perspective. Come on, you guys. Where are his integral ideas? You could point to the one like, he reads mythology poetically. Sort of, but he still takes Christianity literally and favors that one tradition. If that's the only thing that we're going to say is integral about this dude, or that he takes into account multiple traditions, some parts of it, some parts of science, some parts of philosophy, some parts of religion, some parts of other mythology, that does not make for an integral perspective.
You can integrate all the fantasies you want, but it doesn't bring you truth.
Anyways.
The developmental viewpoint never gets mentioned with Jordan.
Yeah, even though he seems like he should know Piaget, he should understand some of these basic stages of development, he should be describing some of that stuff, he doesn't. And again, if we're looking at Jung, and we know he knows about Campbell, there's plenty of other distinctions that his predecessors have made that he doesn't make. So Peterson is not even rising up to the level of the people who he's learned from. He's not standing on their shoulders and building higher. He's not even rising to their level.
And they're looking out there to see what is really missing Is that's how an integral thinker thinks, is wait, there's a little bit of truth in all of this.
It is great that Peterson, as a postmodern thinker, can appreciate the value of traditional and modern worldviews. But part of the reason is because he still holds on to some problematic traditional and modern worldviews. Dude hasn't outgrown the stuff. He's regressive. He's not progressive and integrative. He himself is a postmodernist who attacks postmodernism. He's like a self-hating postmodernist. What he's saying, because he's so intelligent, resonates with people who are at traditional and modern stages. They hear him talking about postmodernism and its problems and how they don't appreciate the traditional and modern worldviews, and they're like, yeah, Peterson's right. So most of Peterson's fans are conventional thinking people. Peterson's conventional, and by conventional, I mean people at traditional, modern, and now postmodern stages. Before, conventional was mostly traditional and modern, but more and more, postmodern thinking is starting to be a part of the common zeitgeist, a part of the convention, and actually less and less the traditional. So these are the stages that Peterson is at. Peterson is a product of the current zeitgeist. He is totally conventional thinking, all fighting with itself inside of his mind. He has some really high-minded ideas that are really smart, like his ability to understand some basic hierarchy stuff and his ability to do the Jungian poetic read of symbolism sometimes, most of the time. But he still believes in traditional, literal Christian ideas and still has pre-trans confusions and is still very conservative. And he's trying to silence the voices of young people who want to change the world by telling them to shut up and go clean their room. How condescending is that? This dude doesn't have a transpersonal worldview. He's not like Sam Harris, who says that there's no such thing as the self, talking about introducing people to meditation and deconstructing the self. This idea from Joseph Campbell that you can recreate yourself in terms of who you want to be, follow your bliss. Jordan says that's dangerous, that we don't understand ourselves well enough to create ourselves. He also says it's dangerous to change around the fundamental parts of society because you'll end up in a ditch. So his idea of personal and cultural development beyond convention and tradition is you'll end up in a ditch. You don't know what you're doing. You'll end up in nihilism. You'll end up in totalitarianism. It's like nihilism or Nazis, meaninglessness. You're going to be in danger if you abandon the traditions and the maps of your culture. That's his main message. And it is coming from a postmodern kind of place of this retreat. Let's go back and hold on tight to what we have because the void is scary.
You're a cultural creature. You cannot live without your culture. You think you can, but you can't. Oh, you killed the thing that protects you. You just wait to see what happens, and that's exactly it. You kill the thing that structures you. You won't know it. It's like Nietzsche's prediction from the death of God. It's like, you killed this. You think, oh, it doesn't make any difference. It's like, wrong. You get rid of that thing that protects you, and chaos comes flooding in, and you have no idea what's possible. We do, though, because we lived through the 20th century. We know exactly what's possible. Hundreds of millions of unnecessary deaths. That's what's possible. We're lucky we didn't blow the whole damn thing up, and we still could. You step outside of the guidelines of your culture at your own peril. And modern people, because they're so coddled, think, oh yeah, well, we can handle it. It's like, sure, you can. You wait till you get there. You'll find out that you can't handle it, and it'll be too late. The whale that you were supposed to go confront and rescue your father from has risen out of the water and taken you down, and you're done. That's chaos.
Because the conclusions that postmodernism comes to will destroy society. So yes, he is looking back and re-including, but he's not re-including with integral distinctions. He's grabbing for these ideas like a crutch and a security blanket. Like he doesn't think that individuals or humanity in general is really ready to grow up and be mature and break our idols and be really responsible. Anyways, I'll keep going.
Those upper three are at each other's throats. They really don't like each other. They've increasingly come to hate each other in many ways. And the problem is because they're all first tier. They can't solve that problem, ever. Because by definition, first tier thinks that its values are the only correct ones. But second tier, that has the inherent capacity to see the importance of all of these and at least start thinking about ways, okay, since everybody has to go through all of these, then an enlightened society would include ways to help us do that. And so that's one of the things that is a way out of the culture wars.
So here's actually a good point. Wilber says people at integral stages have gotten out of the culture wars, and they, if anything, go back in and then help to sort out the problems on these stages. This is not what Jordan Peterson is doing. Jordan Peterson advocates for traditional and conventional values. He's attacking green from a traditional and modern perspective. He's a major player in the culture wars. And his talks with Sam Harris, those are the highest peaks of his maturity, where him and Harris are like getting up to this point in their own development where they're hinting at this higher integral stage and what that might be in the future of their and humanity's development.
It's one thing to have your belief system shattered by the observation that there are other belief systems that are incommensurate but seem to have equal utility. But it's even worse is that once you make the observation that there are other belief systems that have equal utility, then it can shatter your belief in belief systems themselves. And then you're in the postmodern nihilist landscape, and that's a big problem.
Or you could just be in a more fundamental landscape that subsumes both of those belief systems.
That's fine. Let's hope that can happen. Yeah. But I would say that's the landscape that I'm trying to pursue.
They haven't totally gotten there yet and started working their way back down. If anybody's done something like that, it's actually Harris, who's not just this orange atheist that everybody likes to say, like he's this modern rational guy. He is a longtime meditator. He has a podcast called Waking Up, not just clean your room, kid, but like waking up. Then he also comes back and says, look, morality doesn't just have to be based on tradition and the absolute word of God. We can actually use things like science to figure out what's true. And if we know enough about what's true, if we come to some basic moral agreements, it follows that this and this is good for the things that we all value and that we should all value. Out of the two, between Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris is actually the one who's more coming back down the spiral and lifting people up to these higher stages of being able to actually make some real clear, skillful distinctions in the world, where he's talking about this moral landscape, which is something like a spectrum of betters. Not this simplistic, there's heaven and there's hell and there's order and there's chaos. This kind of simplistic, dualistic thinking is indicative of traditional thinking. Duality is not a spectrum. When you talk about a spectrum, it reveals a lot more nuanced thinking.
And so if you're somebody like Jordan Peterson, who is thinking integrally, and you're looking around and seeing what the hell's going on, and you're starting to notice this, and then the government comes along and says, oh, and by the way, I'm going to compel your speech, that would send anybody with integrity and integral thinking over the wall.
But that's not really what happened.
Peterson began to go in public and make all these outlandish claims about what these liberal and transgender activists were trying to do. He either purposely or through his own paranoia completely misrepresented the whole thing to make it seem like people were going to be forced to say things they didn't want to say. Compelled speech. But this was never the case. In fact, due to Peterson's misrepresentation of the bill, the Canadian Bar Association actually had to come out and write a letter debunking the things Peterson was claiming. This is from the Canadian Bar Association, and they said, recently the debate has turned to whether the amendments will force individuals to embrace concepts which they find objectionable. This is a misunderstanding of human rights and hate crimes legislation. For hate crimes, Bill C-16 adds gender identity and expression to the identifiable groups protected, from those who advocate genocide, publicly incite hatred likely to lead to a breach of the peace, or willfully promote hatred against them. For those compelled to speak and act in truth, however unpopular, truth is included in those defenses. Those concerned that they could be criminalized for their repugnant or offensive ideas fail to understand a crucial distinction in the law, as the Supreme Court of Canada has explained. So basically, according to the legal experts in Canada, they are not compelling you to say anything. So no, this is not compelled speech. They are not forcing you to say pronouns if you don't want to, and you would not be fined in jail simply for mislabeling somebody. And here's the craziest part. These laws have already been on the books in all of Canada for years. In fact, where Jordan Peterson lives, this law has already been on the book for 5 years. This was already the law. All Bill C-16 did was make it federally the law. These same exact statutes have been on the books in Ontario, Canada, where Jordan Peterson lives and teaches, for 5 years now. And not once in the 5 years has anybody been affected the way Jordan Peterson claims they would be. In fact, it has already been the law in certain parts of Canada for 15 years, and not one single person's speech has been compelled to call a transgender person anything against their will. And this law has already been federally in place in all of Canada for over a year, Once again, not a single person treated the way Jordan Peterson claimed they would be. He basically came out, misrepresented the law, and then played the victim, like somebody was trying to force him to do something that no one was actually trying to force him to do. Once again, the law had already been in effect for 5 years where he lived, and it had never affected him in any way whatsoever. But suddenly, he saw an opportunity to put himself in the spotlight. And the narrative became, this is just a bunch of crazy social justice warriors who just want to shut him down for his free speech. He's this hero free speech warrior, and these evil lefties are trying to get rid of him over it. And that's the narrative that most of his fans are aware of.
And the problem is freedom of speech. I've never seen Peterson skillfully talk about the truth of the situation around what's going on with transgenderism. It doesn't seem like he really has a clear perspective on it. He's just like, don't compel my speech. He's not making distinctions about what's actually healthy for people, even though he's a psychologist who should probably have a professional opinion on something like this. He's not concerned with other people's psychological health. He's concerned with his own compelled speech. So is this an integral perspective? Like, what quadrant are we talking about?
Forcing unconscious bias retraining and political correctness, and what he saw happening with that, and the nightmare of Bill C-16 threw him up on the net and went viral. The main cause of that, in my opinion, is that it's these orange liberal values of equal opportunity that were getting crushed between the extreme far left of green and the strong far right of ethnocentric amber.
I do think that Peterson is a really good voice for a healthy orange and blue structure. If you're a traditional modern person, Peterson is the man. Peterson is a good role model. And the fact that he's also got some green ideas that help you to maybe start to plant that transrational seed, like maybe some of this mythology that I've been indoctrinated into isn't literally true, he's great. If I was talking to a person who was at a traditional and modern stage, especially a young man, I would definitely recommend some Jordan Peterson. But if you're a postmodern thinker or trying to get into integral, Jordan Peterson is not going to be helpful. He cannot make these distinctions. He does not have an integral perspective. Again, including other perspectives doesn't make you integral. It's how you include them.
That also is an attack on free speech in the worst possible way.
This idea of compelled speech or free speech, it reminds me of one of my favorite Nietzsche quotes, which is a great example of this transrational view or this construct awareness, where he says, "What then is truth? A vast mobile army of metaphors, metonyms, and anthropomorphisms."
In short, a sum of human relations which have been enhanced, transposed, and embellished poetically and rhetorically, and which after long use seem firm, canonical, and obligatory to a people. Truths are illusions about which one has forgotten that is what they are. Metaphors, which are worn out and without sensuous power. Coins, which have lost their pictures and now matter only as metal, no longer as coins. We still do not know where the urge for truth comes from, for as of yet we have heard only of the obligation imposed by society that it should exist. To be truthful means using the customary metaphors in moral terms. The obligation to lie according to fixed convention, to lie, heard like in a style obligatory for all.
In other words, to even speak language at all, to say evolution should be called evolution or the atom should be called the atom, that's all compelled speech. If you want to talk, you have to play along. And Jordan Peterson's whole thing is that whatever society decides, whatever rises to the top must be true and thus good because it's popular. This is his whole naturalistic fallacy.
You step outside of the guidelines of your culture at your own peril.
So it should be right along with his perspective that if society votes it up to the top, then it must be the good way to go.
This is where I'm going to sound like a postmodernist, which I really hate.
Jordan Peterson, like most postmodernists, is constantly living in performative self-contradiction, constantly caught up in hypocrisy, constantly having problems with integrity.
The Western Enlightenment was emphasizing what the French philosophers called the système de la nature, the great whole interlocking system as a whole. John Locke actually called it the great interlocking order. The second most common idea in the Western Enlightenment was the great chain of being. It's the single most widely adopted overall philosophy that the larger percentage of sensitive, educated men and women have adopted throughout virtually all of our civilizations, up to and including the the Western Enlightenment.
Wilber talking about the great chain of being here reminds me of this idea of all of the world being mythology and us participating within the myth that we get from Joseph Campbell. By the way, if you like Jordan Peterson, you are going to really like Joseph Campbell. You should go to Netflix, watch his series, The Power of Myth, and then watch the Integral Review Live series where Alyosha and I do a talk on each one of the episodes. It's really good stuff.
And there are actually some studies of those kinds of patriarchal cultures that showed quality of life was much less for men than it was for women. And those were roles that both of them were stuck with.
I think Ken Wilber does a really good job here of putting this battle of the sexes thing in context. I agree with Wilber about this stuff, and I actually think he articulates these issues a whole lot better than Peterson does.
You just mentioned male and female, and that's something that Peterson has been criticized for quite a lot, for equating the masculine with order and the feminine with chaos. This is a theological point, and maybe it's a simplified theological point. What do you make of that?
It's not my favorite aspect of what he does. I can agree with the importance of order and chaos, and that these are two of the very, very fundamental dualisms that this manifest world is made of.
Overly simplistic dualities.
And he doesn't just identify, he doesn't say female is chaos and male is order. He says female is symbolic of. It doesn't make it much better, though. I don't find that a terribly compelling piece of information.
When you create these kinds of binaries, I know when I was first kind of realizing this sort of idea of duality and unity, yin and yang, and Star of David, and even Joseph Campbell talks about the binary nature of reality. But when you start lining up all of these binaries as if all of the different opposites line up with each other, like heaven and hell, and man and woman, and you start being like, oh, woman and hell and chaos, and when you start equating all of what you would maybe consider dark or negative things together, then you do start to get some of these bad ideas, like, oh, the woman is the path of hell and chaos. And yeah, that is violent and wrong and messed up and unskillful and all that. When you start lining up these binaries and then conflating them all into each other, you can get into some serious confusion and some serious problems. That's why this simplistic dualistic thinking is not really good when it comes to actually metasystemic perspectives. It's good basic poetry and symbolism, and it can be good to lead to some insights, but within those dark and light sides, there's a bunch of nuanced perspectives, and of course there's the shadow element in the light side and the light elements in the dark side. And so it's not as simple as these basic dualities. It can be really a problematic way of thinking about things. I think one of the main themes that we see at Green is the pre-trans confusion, but also the far-sighted mishmashing. You have far-sighted mishmashing where you take a bunch of things that look or sound similar and you squish them together into one thing that might often be like this new kind of weird hybrid. And then there's another problem of conflation where you go, oh, all this other stuff kind of looks like my thing, and so all this other stuff is really saying this thing that's my thing. Both of these things are the two main problems that happen at Green. Wilber and Peterson both do a little bit of both. They both run into both of these problems a little bit. They're very common problems at Green, this bad integration. There's healthy actual integral stages making these distinctions, and then there's these still green problems with bad integration. And as we know, people are not just simply at a stage in a rigid kind of way that there's this spectrum of unfolding, and so some lines reach higher and usually the cognitive line runs higher. So we're seeing that in Peterson, is that his cognitive line is running ahead, but there's still a lot of work to be done. There's still a lot of shadow work to be done. There's still a lot of issues down the spiral that will result in those better distinctions to actually help him to move fully into those stages. And Wilber has ignored a lot of his shadow too. He hasn't really been very good about engaging with his critics and dealing with some real peer review on these kinds of subjects. He just acts like no one's qualified to be critical of him. If you disagree with him, you must just be immature. So he definitely has some issues with bad integration too, that he should really know better, because he does know better. He specifically makes these distinctions, but then still tends to favor his bias. So we all have our issues, our areas where we still need work, and Ken Wilber is no exception to this.
People that aren't really sophisticated on these things are really misinterpreting what he's saying anyway.
Now, I do think that a lot of people who criticize Jordan Peterson are doing it from a left-leaning perspective where they are getting caught up in what we would call pre-trans confusion themselves, which is like they're confusing post-conventional criticisms with pre-conventional criticisms. I think he has a more nuanced view than some of his critics want to give him credit for. People want to demonize people that they want to reject, and that's definitely happening with Peterson as well. So not all of his critics are great critics, but definitely I do think that a lot of the things that Peterson says are problematic, and the ways that he says them are often not as skillful as they could be. So that's definitely an issue.
We have this leading edge green, which is broken mostly, not allowing us to even discuss these issues, because everything simply has to be equal outcome, and if it's not, there's discrimination. There's sexism, there's racism, there's something going on. It's not that those aren't occurring, it's just those aren't only occurring.
This is what I was saying about people who are postmodernists on the left wanting to reduce Jordan to just phobic, racist, sexist, what have you. A lot of that stuff is overblown. Now, does he have some of those kind of tendencies? Maybe so. I have heard some things that sound certainly problematic.
I know how to stand up to a man who's unfairly trespassing against me. We talk, we argue, we push, and then it becomes physical. If we move beyond the boundaries of civil discourse, we know what the next step is. Okay, that's forbidden in discourse with women. When men are talking to each other in any serious manner, that underlying threat of physicality is always there, especially if it's a real conversation, and it keeps the thing civilized to some degree. You know, if you're talking to a man who wouldn't fight with you under any circumstances whatsoever, then you're talking to someone to whom you have absolutely no respect. There's a woman in Toronto who's been organizing this movement, let's say, against me, and she's quite offensive, you might say. She compared us to Nazis, for example. But I'm defenseless against that kind of female insanity, because the techniques that I would use against a man who is employing those tactics are forbidden to me. I don't see any regulating force for that terrible femininity, and it seems to me to be invading the culture and undermining the masculine power of the culture in a way that's, I think, fatal.
You could always excuse that by saying, well, that's not real communism, which is the sort of statement that should immediately get you punched in the nose hard enough to knock you out, as far as I'm concerned. So,
here's a rule. How about no makeup in the workplace? Why do you make your lips red? Because they turn red during sexual arousal. That's why. Why do you put rouge on your cheeks? Same reason. How about high heels? They're there to exaggerate sexual attractiveness. That's what high heels do. They tilt your pelvis forward so your hips stick out, and they tighten up your calf muscles. They're a sexual display. Now, I'm not saying that people shouldn't use sexual displays in the workplace. I'm not saying that.
I'm not saying that.
I'm not saying that. Here's a rule. How about no makeup in the workplace? But I am saying that that is what they're doing, and that is what they're doing. The Maoists put everybody in uniforms to stop that sort of thing from happening. Men wear uniforms. That's the way they wear suits.
A serious woman who does not want sexual harassment in the workplace, do you feel like if she wears makeup in the workplace that she is somewhat being critical?
Yeah. I do think that. This means rejecting, among other things, the misbegotten idea of casual sexual gratification. Sex is either the impulsive, short-term gratification of a domineering biological instinct, or the union of two conscious spirits taking responsibility for what they are doing. The former is simply not commensurate with the demands of an advanced civilization, which requires the adoption of responsibility above all for its preservation, maintenance, and expansion. Now, with regards to gay marriage specifically, that's a really tough one for me. I'm concerned about the undermining of traditional modes of being. I'm concerned about the undermining of traditional modes of being, including marriage, which has technically and historically been a union between a man and a woman fundamentally for the purpose of raising children in an optimal and stable environment. Traditional modes of being, traditional modes of being, traditional modes of being. What are your thoughts about gay people raising children? I mean, you have problems, right? If you're both of the same sex, then you're going to have the problem of how to provide the proper model. Kids in intact heterosexual families where the father is present do way better.
I think a lot of where he's coming from with some of that kind of stuff is from a place of good intention, not necessarily from a place of hate. But he still winds up giving people who are hateful, reasonable sounding ways of hating on people. And so I can see why people who care about racism and sexism and phobia and stuff like that can be concerned with the voice of someone like Jordan Peterson contributing to some of those negative conversations. But yeah, again, having these conversations is how we figure things out, how we grow, and there's going to be development, which means that we need to be able to have these conversations and not just shut down with some kind of dogmatic idea like, no, you're not allowed to think that way. If you think that way, you think that way. And the only way you're going to stop thinking that way is if somebody argues you out of it. So we have to be able to have the conversation.
If I have some shadow material, it runs in the direction that Jordan Peterson does. The postmodern theorists, and very angry making for me. It really was infuriating.
You share his anger?
Very much.
Definitely, Wilber is also very critical of Green, so it would make sense that he would resonate with Peterson around a lot of this criticism and that he would be hearing, oh, this is integral.
The things he attacks in postmodernism are all the extremist, regressive, outrageously idiotic aspects of it, but he still uses some of its core ideas.
But a lot of people say he doesn't transcend and include Green. You think he does?
I think he does. The part of Green that he doesn't like is the extremist, identity politics, neo-Marxist aspects.
He clearly doesn't include the healthy deconstruction of green, nor does he seem to have a healthy relationship with the progressive civil rights aspect of green. One might argue these are the most healthy and important parts of green. He hasn't deconstructed his Christianity, he hasn't deconstructed the society, he hasn't deconstructed the self or the ego, and he came on the scene fighting against civil rights, pretending like it had something to do with freedom of speech. Just ask yourself what are the most healthy parts of green, and then ask yourself if Jordan Peterson is in touch with that, and it seems like the answer is no.
How can he be integral when he is so anti-green?
Even this guy knows.
He is making use of those capacities, although he's also transcended and included. So he's using capacities that will encompass the limitations of having just that stage.
I do think Peterson has integral intuitions. I think he has integral insights. I don't think he has any of the language or clear distinctions or consistent methodology that's actually an integral perspective. He's like on the cusp between green and integral. He's still figuring it out. All right, let's break down a recap.
Because he's clearly an integral thinker.
That's very easy to claim, but I don't see the evidence of it.
He has an enormous amount of respect for objective science. But what he realizes is that there are these other validity claims that aren't just objective, material, exterior truth.
When it comes to quadrants, does Peterson include all the quadrants? Well, kind of, but not in a skillful way with an integral methodology. Ken Hovind includes all 4 quadrants. Ken Hovind roots a lot of his stuff in science.
Biblical view of creation is certainly scientific. It makes predictions, okay?
But he's still a fundamentalist.
He would start interpreting religion as his archetypal, and he's just moving through the Bible and doing that.
Okay, and sure, maybe when it comes to Ken Hovind, he doesn't think of the Bible in an archetypal kind of way. But Jordan Peterson doesn't consistently think of these things in an archetypal kind of way either. So that's a problem. In terms of stages,
the one area where I would like to see Peterson give more attention is growth hierarchies, in terms of some specific stages that they go through, the developmental viewpoint. But that never gets mentioned with Jordan.
He doesn't really talk about stages. Okay, so there's a point against him. In terms of lines, well,
if you look at all of the sort of dozen or so multiple intelligences, and again, if you don't like that concept, I know Peterson doesn't like that.
He doesn't really have that healthy of an integration of lines. He wants to reduce everything to the cognitive line. So there's a problem. That's going to be a mark against him. In terms of states,
Peterson is perfectly aware of waking up. He's absolutely aware of it, but he doesn't really talk about that.
It does seem like he's aware of states, and he's done psychedelics, but he doesn't really seem to have had an existential awakening or a transpersonal view. And he certainly isn't teaching about that or encouraging anyone in that direction. So not only does it seem like he doesn't really want to encourage his students to take psychedelics, I also haven't heard him encourage his students to take on any kind of meditation or state training practice. And that would be really helpful to them. Ken Wilber and Peterson probably disagree about states, but Peterson definitely includes them in his map of reality. So we'll give him half a point there. And types.
The big 5-factor analysis. I totally agree with that. It's part of what we call types. It's an actual ingredient of the integral framework. We totally include that.
Sure, he includes types. Okay, so
it's meta-systemic. It introduces a fourth-person perspective, which just means it can reflect on the universal third-person perspectives that Orange brought into existence and that were so profound for the Western world. But a fourth-person perspective is a capacity to actually reflect on that and make certain critical announcements about it. Peterson does that. He's fully aware of doing that. He's using that meta-systemic capacity. But he also has a capacity for paradigmatic and cross-paradigmatic thinking.
I agree that Peterson has a meta-systemic perspective. That's what happens at Green. But I don't really see any ideas that are paradigmatic or cross-paradigmatic. Someone's going to have to point to those for me.
He doesn't just reflect on those things. He tries to tie them together. He wants to integrate science and religion. And so he is making use of those capacities. He has access to paradigmatic and cross-paradigmatic stuff.
It's great to want to integrate religion and science, but that doesn't make you a cross-paradigmatic thinker. It doesn't make you integrally informed. It doesn't even mean that you are doing it with good integral standards. Again, Ken Hovind also wants to integrate religion and science, and just like Jordan Peterson, he conveniently ignores science where it comes into conflict with his belief system. I'm not really seeing an integral perspective here. What I'm seeing is a really smart green Christian. It's interesting, one of the things that I've noticed around this whole problem is people being like, well, this guy's integral, right? Or Peterson is integral. Here's what I think. If you are really integrally informed, then you understand the lessons and the pitfalls at every stage, and you probably also know about several different variations on the theme at every stage. And so you can see, okay, Peterson, he's got this idea. It's at this level, and it's a good one. He's got this idea at this level, and it's not such a good one. Okay, look at this one. Look at this one. This is good. This is not so good. And you can see where his ideas are at clearly. And you can say, this man does not even reside at an integral altitude. He's at these conventional stages. All of his ideas are within this conventional altitude. Unless you can point to his integral ideas and really say why he's integral, then you're not getting it right yourself. And not only does this show that you're not getting it right yourself, but probably that you yourself are not really fully integral, which is part of what we're seeing here with even Ken Wilber. And for those who are going, oh my goodness, how can you be so arrogant as to think that you know more about this stuff than Wilber? Well, because I believe in this great chain of being, this idea that we stand on the shoulders of giants. I think that the students of Wilber who come along later and get to learn everything he has to teach are going to be better than Wilber. This is to be expected. So yeah, I respect Wilber as one of the founding fathers of integral, and I think he mostly gets it right. I think the ways he gets it wrong, he ends up breaking his own rules in favor of his bias. So it's not that he's not a smart guy or that he doesn't know what he's talking about. It's just that he doesn't act it out perfectly or apply his methods perfectly. Let's continue. If you enjoy this clip, consider watching the full-length version. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoy. If you do, please like and subscribe and check out more videos.